Sweden is often associated with tranquility and idyllic small towns, but even here there are places that tell a very different story. One of them is an abandoned psychiatric hospital that has stood silent for decades. We are in the tiny town of Säter, hidden in the endless forest northwest of Stockholm. For centuries, those forests have provided work and prosperity, giving rise to a thriving timber industry and the beautiful wooden architecture that still defines the town today. At first glance, Säter feels like countless other quiet Swedish towns. But just beyond its peaceful streets lies a place with a completely different story. As we leave the quiet streets behind and head deeper into the woods, the atmosphere begins to change. The last signs of everyday life gradually disappear, replaced by silence and towering trees. Then, almost without warning, the first abandoned hospital buildings emerge from the forest, hinting at the scale of what lies ahead. Today, the complex stands silent and abandoned. The empty roads, boarded up windows, and overgrown paths give little hint of what this place once was. But for much of the 20th century, these grounds were home to one of Sweden's largest and most influential psychiatric hospitals. What we are looking at is far more than a handful of abandoned buildings. Spread across the forest are dozens of pavilions, staff residences, workshops, utility buildings, and treatment facilities. At its peak, thousands of people, patients, doctors, nurses, and other staff passed through these grounds every single day. In many ways, this wasn't just a hospital, it was a self-contained community with its own routines, rules, and way of life. For some people, it was a place of hope and recovery. For others, it became home for years, sometimes even decades. Opened in 1912, it was one of the largest and most progressive psychiatric institutions in Sweden. At the time, Säter itself had only around 1,000 residents, while the hospital was designed to accommodate more than 800 patients. At its peak, the complex was almost a city within a city, with dozens of buildings spread across the grounds and even its own railway connection, linking it to the main railway line running through the town. The decision to build it in such an isolated location reflected early 20th century beliefs that silence, fresh air, and nature could help people recover from mental illness. At the same time, building hospitals like this, far from major cities, also kept them separated from everyday society. That isolation became especially important for Fasta Pavilion, the hospital's maximum security ward, for patients who had committed serious crimes and required psychiatric treatment. One of the most famous patients was Sigvard Nilsson Toneman, the leader of the infamous Sally gang. Intelligent and highly manipulative, he led the gang members into a series of brutal crimes. He was eventually sent to Säter, where he spent more than 30 years. Another notorious patient was Lars-Inge Svartenbrandt, one of Sweden's most infamous criminals. He was responsible for numerous armed robberies and became known for repeatedly escaping from prison. Swedish newspapers eventually dubbed him the most dangerous criminal in Sweden. Not every story ended in tragedy, however. One of the last patients of the maximum security ward was Jimmy Fagerstig, who arrived at Säter as a teenager after committing serious crimes. He managed to leave his criminal past behind, was released, and spent the final years of his life as a free man, happily married, and far removed from the life that had brought him to Säter. Luckily, the history of this place didn't disappear when its patients were gone. One of the surviving buildings became a museum, preserving the past of the hospital and Swedish psychiatry. Walking through its halls, it quickly becomes clear just how dramatically psychiatric care has changed over the past century. Many of the objects on display are difficult to look at today. Restraint devices, cages, and other equipment were considered a necessary part of treatment and security. for patients who might harm themselves or others. But it's important to remember that what we see today as frightening or even inhuman was at the time often presented as a practical and medically justified way of controlling severe psychiatric symptoms. The museum also highlights the story of Hibernal, one of the first antipsychotic medications introduced in the 1950s. Its arrival marked a turning point, giving doctors an entirely new way to treat severe mental illness. Another chapter explores one of the most controversial medical procedures in psychiatric history, lobotomy. Once celebrated as a revolutionary treatment, its inventor, Portuguese neurologist Egas Muniz, was even awarded the Nobel Prize. Only years later did the devastating long-term consequences become fully understood. But despite these dark subjects, the museum's real focus is not on the treatments, it's on the people. Most of those who lived here weren't violent criminals. They were ordinary people struggling with mental illnesses. Many of the conditions that once required years of hospitalization can now be successfully treated thanks to modern medicine, effective medications, and a far better understanding of mental health. Maybe that's why the most touching thing in the museum has little to do with medical equipment or old patient records. Outside, in a small pavilion, stands a mannequin covered with handwritten notes left by visiting school children. Everything will be okay, take care of yourself, be yourself. Those simple messages aren't just meant for the people who once lived behind these walls. They speak to anyone struggling with their mental health today. And perhaps they capture the biggest change of all. Over the last century, Swedish society has moved from fear and isolation towards understanding, compassion, and hope.